Okay, so we have learned how to factor out the GCF. We have learned how to factor binomials and the difference of squares. We have learned how to factor trinomials where the leading coefficient was 1, and also trinomials where the leading coefficient was not 1. So the last thing we're going to learn when it comes to factoring is factoring a polynomial that actually has 4 terms. Okay? So x squared plus 7x squared plus 2x plus 14. See, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 terms. So the first step here is we're going to group the first 2 terms together and the last 2 terms together. So we use a grouping symbol, parentheses. So we're going to group the first 2 together, and then we're going to group the second 2 together. Okay, so we've created 2 separate groups. Now this process is only going to be used on polynomials with 4 terms. Step 2, I'm going to factor out the GCF from each binomial. So the GCF here between x to the third and x squared, well, there's no number that divides into them, but they both have x's, and the smallest one is an x squared. So I can factor out an x squared out of here. So remember, I'm going to write down my GCF, and then I'm going to divide everything by x squared, which is the GCF. So we're going to divide everything by the GCF, which is x squared. So x to the third divided by x squared leaves me with just x. 7x squared divided by x squared, the x squareds cancel out, and you're left with just 7. Okay, in the second group, 2x plus 14, I'm going to repeat that process. I'm going to factor out the GCF out of both of these, which would be 2, positive 2. So I'm going to take that GCF and I'm going to write it right here behind this parentheses, and I'm going to factor out a positive 2. So I'm going to divide everything by 2, and I'll put my leftovers in here. 2x divided by 2 is just x, and 14 divided by 2 is 7. So now if you notice, the 2 parentheses that I've created are identical, and that is imperative. These 2 parentheses must match in order for you to continue with this problem. So here's the next step. These 2 parentheses that match, I'm going to create a parentheses here that has that x plus 7 in it, and then I'm going to cross them out, and I've used them. So now I'm going to create another parentheses, and I'm going to use the 2 things that I did not cross out, the x squared and the positive 2. Okay? And then you can always check your answer by foiling or distributing, whatever method you want to use, to see if you get back to this. So let's try this problem. I'm going to factor. I'm going to group the first 2 terms together. I'm going to factor out an x squared out of the first one because that's what I can divide out of this. X to the third over x squared is x. 4x squared over x squared is just 4. The GCF here would be 8. So I'm going to divide an 8 out of this, and that would leave me with 8x over 8 is x, and 32 over 8 is 4, and these parentheses match. Don't stop here. You're going to be tempted to stop, but you got to do this last step. This parentheses that match, I'm going to make one of my parentheses that, and the other parentheses what I didn't cross out, x squared plus 8. Okay, so let's look at question number 5, because your GCFs are going to change from problem to problem, but this process is the same. I'm going to group these first 2 together, and then I'm going to group these last 2 together. The GCF of this first group now would be p to the third, because they share the same variable, and the smallest exponent is a p, or smallest exponent is a 3. So I'm going to divide out the GCF. So I'm going to divide everything by p to the third. This leaves me with p to the second minus 6p to the third over p to the third would just be 6. Okay, now out of here I can divide out a 2. So watch this. When I divide out a 2, I end up with, that's a negative p squared plus 6. Now remember, these needed to match. They don't match. They almost match, but they're opposites. That's a positive p squared. That's a negative p squared. That's a negative 6. That's a positive 6. So in order to get them to match for this problem, instead of factoring out a positive 2, how about I factor out a negative 2? So let's factor out a negative 2. So now negative 2p squared over negative 2 is p squared, and 12 over negative 2 is negative 6, and now these parentheses match. So my final answer in one parentheses will be this parentheses that matches, the p squared minus 6, and the other parentheses will be this p to the third minus 2. Okay? Let's look at one more. Number 6. 4 terms. Group the first 2, group the last 2. The GCF here out of v to the third and v to the second is just v to the second. So I'm going to divide out a v to the second. That would give me v to the third over v to the second. This one would leave me with just v. V to the second over v to the second would be negative 1. Over here, I'm going to divide out. If I divide out a 3, that's going to leave me with negative v. So I'm going to divide out a negative 3. And this would leave me with v minus 1. And now the parentheses match. V minus 1 goes in one of the parentheses. And v squared minus 3 goes in the other parentheses. Okay, let's see if there's any more. Let's just try one more. 4 terms, no GCF. I'm going to group the first 2 and group the last 2. The GCF here would be 8a to the second. So I'm going to divide an 8a to the second just out of the first group here. That would leave me with 2a plus 1. I need a 2a plus 1 over here, so instead of factoring out a 3, I'm going to factor out a negative 3. You kind of have to investigate the problem to see what would get you these parentheses to match. Negative 6 divided by negative 3 is 2a. Negative 3 divided by negative 3 is positive 1. Now these parentheses match. So 2a plus 1 goes in one of the parentheses, and 8a squared minus 3 goes in the other parentheses. Okay, I want you to try number 10. I'm going to work the problem. I made a sign error. It should be minus. Now they match. So there we go.